Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us for this special event. I am Suzanne LeBlanc, the Director of Clinical Relationships for the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, and I'm honored to have an esteemed group of colleagues share their expertise in honor of World Alzheimer's Day. The Focused Ultrasound Foundation is incredibly appreciative to partner today's webinar with Us Against Alzheimer's and the Global Alzheimer's Platform Foundation. In the next hour, we'll hear from leaders in patient advocacy, research, and medical manufacturing about the scope of the Alzheimer's disease crisis and how they are exploring the use of focused ultrasound, a revolutionary non-invasive technology to open the blood-brain barrier and treat patients. Please allow me to briefly summarize the agenda for the next hour. First, we will start off with an introduction from George Vradenburg, chairman and co-founder of Us Against Alzheimer's. George will help set the stage, defining the scope of the Alzheimer's challenge and the need to bring new therapies forward to find a cure. Next, we will hear from Dr. Nir Lipsman. He's a neurosurgeon and director of the Hartwell Center for Neuromodulation at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center. He will provide an overview of translational research with focused ultrasound, highlighting current clinical trials. Third, I am sure you will be inspired listening to Dr. Desai. He's Chief Strategic Innovation Officer at InsightTech. Dr. Desai will highlight the innovative Florida Brain State Initiative, a collaboration between prominent universities, state government, and industry to work towards improving the care of Alzheimer's disease patients in our community. And finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sandra Black, neurologist, senior scientist, and director of the Dr. Sandra Black Center for Brain Resilience and Recovery at Sunnybrook Research Institute. She will discuss the current methods used to diagnose and treat Alzheimer's disease patients and the potential of focused ultrasound to overcome current barriers. Following these speakers, John Dwyer Jr., a serial medical entrepreneur and president and co-founder of the Global Alzheimer's Platform Foundation and founding board member of Us Against Alzheimer's, will join us for the panel discussion. The Global Alzheimer's Platform Foundation is dedicated to funding Alzheimer's research and making the clinical trial process for Alzheimer's therapies substantially more efficient. Interestingly, there are actually 8 different focused ultrasound manufacturers that are actively involved in researching how focused ultrasound can treat Alzheimer's disease, as you can see in this chart. Although many use blood-brain barrier opening as a mechanism of action, you can see that some are also exploring neuromodulation. The FUS Foundation is currently participating in funding for some of these companies. The pictures on the left show how some of these machines work. One of the machines is MRI guided. So a helmet is placed over the entire skull and the patient is placed in the MRI machine during the procedure. Another company uses an implanted focused ultrasound device into the skull, and most of the other ones use neuronavigational technique, where a focused ultrasound transducer is placed over the skull and a previously performed MRI scan in a computer helps guide the transducer and the beam into the correct location. Now let's hear from the experts. George, the floor is yours.
My name is George Vradenburg. I'm the co-founder and chairman of Us Against Alzheimer's, an advocacy group founded in 2010 in order to stop Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is now one of the world's greatest global health problems. 50 million families, which implies some well into the hundreds of millions of individuals now have the disease and are experiencing the disease. Given the pace at which populations are aging around the world, that number is expected to rise to 150 million families and over 500 million people in the next 2 to 3 decades. This is a challenge of enormous magnitude. So this is a challenge that I take with you to try to figure out to eliminate this gargantuan human suffering and the extraordinary financial consequences to the world. Now over $1 trillion a year, rising to $2 trillion in 2030, which means over the next decade, $17 trillion in global GDP being devoted simply to the care and management of families with the disease. Given the fact that most people around the world are aging, this is a great news from the 20th century, but in fact, Alzheimer's is one of those diseases which puts the last 8 to 10 years of your life in limbo. Our brain spans are not equaling our lifespans. And so longevity has this disastrous dividend at the end of life for most people. Over age 85, a third of the people have Alzheimer's, and as a consequence, their families are experiencing it. This is a tricky disease. The brain is a very complicated animal. The science is not totally understood, to say the least. There are a variety of toxic proteins known to be characterizing this disease, but they are only a partial solution. So scientific advances have been made in the last 10 years. We now know that we can actually see the living brain with scanning equipment, PET scanning equipment. So we now know that this disease starts 20 to 30 years before symptoms. Now, this is a potentially scary proposition, that you can know that you have a potentially fatal disease way before you actually get the symptoms of it and die from it. But on the other hand, this is a wonderful opportunity, so that if we can detect the disease early and we can treat it before symptoms occur, we can prevent symptomatic disease. Much like we have successfully done with HIV/AIDS, where you can be HIV positive but never die of AIDS. Currently, the drugs that are moving through the late stage pipeline are called monoclonal antibodies. They're biologic products which are difficult to manufacture, that are partial solution because they tend to reduce what are now perceived to be the toxic proteins associated with this disease, amyloid and tau. But we need all hands on deck. So focused ultrasound really gives us an opportunity to try another technology approach that may be much more effective. The challenge with all these new technologies is, can you detect the disease early? Can you treat the disease early before symptoms and prevent symptomatic onset of the disease? With focused ultrasound, potentially we have the ability to do that. The next challenge, how do you get it at scale and at a cost that's available to individuals at risk of this disease in all resource settings, not just high resource countries, high academic institutions or major hospitals, but in regular clinical practice. So that's a real great challenge. It's a challenge we ought to undertake. It's a challenge we're going to have to undertake in order to get this disease treated. In the United States, Blacks are twice as likely to have this disease as whites. Hispanic Americans are 1.5 times as likely to have this disease as non-Hispanic whites. So low income, racial minorities, women are twice as likely to have this disease than men. So how do we make sure that we can get new technology approaches to preventing and treating this disease early to all the populations who are at risk at earlier stages of the disease, making sure that we get inexpensive, widely accessible diagnostic products, blood-based markers, digital cognitive assessments, so that we can introduce new interventions that can prevent this disease before symptoms of the disease manifest themselves. So I think this is an exciting time. It's an exciting time for new opportunities, new digital technologies, focused ultrasound technologies. So we look forward to this webinar to understand best how we're going to get those focused ultrasound products through the clinical trial process, prove their effectiveness and their safety. In fact, if you're going to introduce an intervention when people are healthy and before they have symptoms, safety is going to be a critical attribute to look at all these products in development. And then how do we get it at a price point and at an administrative scale so that we can get it to all the people that are at risk with the disease. So I welcome this conversation. The Alzheimer's community is eager to hear all these new developments in focused ultrasound and look forward to the conversation. So thank you very much for attending today.
So I'd just like to thank the Focused Ultrasound Foundation for organizing today and for the invitation to take part in the webinar this morning. It's a privilege to join you. My name is Nir Lipsman, and I'm a neurosurgeon and scientist at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center in Toronto, where we've been involved in focused ultrasound human trials and investigations for at least the last 5 years or so. So in the next 5 minutes, I'll just provide a very quick update on where our field stands in terms of human applications of ultrasound in Alzheimer's, work that very much stands on the shoulders of quite a compelling body of work that's done in animal models, much of which also has been done here at Sunnybrook as well. So, of course, the rationale for the work in humans comes from the recognition, as we've heard, that the blood-brain barrier is a major challenge for the delivery of therapies to the brain, potentially effective therapies that would be even more effective if they were able to gain access to the brain. So a way to overcome that barrier has been a major objective for our field. To date, though, most of those approaches have either been fraught with too much risk in the form of surgery or implants, or have been non-specific or just not effective. So work done in transgenic animal models of Alzheimer's disease, including work done by Isabelle Aubert here at Sunnybrook, showed that perhaps focused ultrasound may be a potential important strategy. And although there is many years of work that went into this, it can be summarized really in 2 points, which is that it appears that focused ultrasound can indeed safely open the blood-brain barrier and enhance the delivery of therapeutics, oftentimes anti-amyloid or other kinds of antibodies, ultimately leading to clearance of amyloid. And also that focused ultrasound alone, even without a drug being delivered, can help clear amyloid, other neuropathologic associates of Alzheimer's, and potentially lead to memory improvements. So that was really the impetus for human trials and some of the first human studies, including our own with focused ultrasound in human populations. And the first study was launched in 2017, ultimately published a couple of years later in 2019. And in this study, we recruited patients with mild Alzheimer's disease who were amyloid positive on PET scans. So this was a safety trial, and we really tried to show that if we specifically targeted those amyloid positive regions, specifically in the frontal lobe, which was a putatively more safe region of the brain to target, that we can do it safely, that the procedure was technically feasible, and the patients tolerated it well. So this was the proverbial shot across the bow, that we can, in fact, reversibly and repeatedly open the blood-brain barrier. So the next phase of the trial really expanded that. And what we did was, in a study that's now recruiting up to 30 patients, we're about a third of the way through, we're targeting much larger volumes in the brain and regions that are specifically involved in memory and cognition, including the hippocampus, the parietal lobe, and the entorhinal cortex. So this is a study that really tries to comprehensively study really the safety, the feasibility, and the tolerability of much larger blood-brain barrier openings in patients, again, who are amyloid positive with mild to moderate Alzheimer's. So this work has now been replicated in a couple studies, including in the United States. So this is work done by Dr. Desai, West Virginia University, who showed again that in 6 patients with mild to moderate disease, opening the blood-brain barrier specifically in medial, temporal, so in hippocampal regions is safe, is reversible. It's a procedure that can be done as an outpatient, and that extensive regions could be associated with potentially even amyloid reduction in those populations. Professor Jinwoo Chang's group in Korea further showed that you can actually open quite extensive regions of the bifrontal area in patients with more advanced Alzheimer's disease, and indeed do that in a safe procedure as well. So again, every study that is being done is really iterative, is growing, is really providing that additional safety data to show that larger volumes in different and varied populations with Alzheimer's disease and patients specifically with amyloid positivity can be done in a well-tolerated procedure. So there are other groups, and most of the work to date has been with the Insightec Exablate machine, which is a hemispheric array of ultrasound transducers, over 1,000 of them. But other groups, including in Korea, and in Europe and in Taiwan, are investigating different strategies, including single or multiple transducers in relatively small prospective trials, finding that in fact, ultrasound modulation in patients with Alzheimer's disease appears to be safe, technically feasible, with clinical and imaging results, however, yet to show any significant improvement. So much of these are very much early days, but certainly growing in terms of interest, and we're waiting to see the results of these studies in the years ahead. So one of the questions that really remains in the field is whether you use ultrasound as a drug delivery strategy or whether you want to use it as a standalone therapeutic strategy. The question there remains, if you do try to deliver a drug, are you getting that drug into the brain? And last year, we were able to show in a different trial where we were able to tag a chemotherapy compound that we wanted to deliver to the brain in the form of some kinds of brain cancer, that in fact, there is an enriched concentration of a large antibody in the brain after treatment. So this was one of the first studies that in fact showed and confirmed that large molecule therapeutics can gain access to the brain after opening the blood-brain barrier with focused ultrasound, giving us hope that whatever it is that we do end up wanting to deliver in the context of Alzheimer's can in fact gain access to the brain. So what is so far the global experience? Well, although there's intense amount of interest growing, less than 50 patients worldwide have undergone focused ultrasound for Alzheimer's disease. So that includes drug delivery or just opening the blood-brain barrier or neuromodulation strategies. So what have been some of the lessons learned so far? Well, in general, these are well-tolerated outpatient procedures. There have been no reported serious adverse events, specifically with opening the blood-brain barrier, that we can target large multi-targets in the brain, large volumes in eloquent cortex. So these are critical, important brain regions involved in memory, cognition, and mood, and that we can do that safely and technically feasibly. But the technology itself is evolving in real time. So it's a very different procedure now than it was perhaps even 2 or 3 years ago when we started doing these procedures, that it's a much more efficient procedure. It's much more targeted. The imaging is evolving, and both the software and hardware are evolving in real time. So what are the next steps as a field where we're keenly interested in determining what therapeutic to deliver to the brain? And this can be an antibody, this can be other kinds of agents. So that work is ongoing. Technical advances both in the hardware that we're using and also in software and how we're able to image and what we're able to see and how we can ultimately confirm that what we want to achieve, we are achieving. And finally, defining meaningful outcomes for patients and caregivers. What does that mean in the context of Alzheimer's disease? Is it a slowing down of the disease? Is it a reversal of the disease? Is it changes ultimately down the road in the structure and in the function of the brain? Or is it really a quality of life issue that we want to address? So all of these things are happening in concert as we try to develop these treatments. So I wanted to conclude on a hopeful note as we together try to tackle what sometimes can seem like an insurmountable problem in Alzheimer's, and that this is a rapidly evolving, rapidly growing field. And when you just do a very cursory search of the literature on PubMed of the work done with focused ultrasound and Alzheimer's, you can see that the field was really born no more than about 15 years ago, but it's rapidly expanding. So each one of these bars is the number of publications per year that we're seeing in the field. And we're seeing this continue to grow. So we have every reason to believe that focused ultrasound holds tremendous promise, whether as a strategy in and of itself or as a drug delivery strategy. And time will really tell with continued study whether in fact it can be that important tool that we're looking for fighting the disease. So thank you again to the Focused Ultrasound Foundation for the invitation, and happy to take any questions.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you joining us from around the world. My name is JJ Desai. It's a privilege to be with you today and to represent InsightTech as Chief Strategic Innovation Officer for a company that is developing technology to take on some of the most impactful and chronic diseases of our time. It's a true privilege to be able to talk to you about the advancements in our technology using focused ultrasound, our collaborations with government and private entities that are advancing some of the most serious disease states and our awareness of those, particularly Alzheimer's disease today, and to discuss with this esteemed panel of colleagues how we move the evidence that we've generated forward in a meaningful and impactful way, most importantly for patients, but also for the caregivers and society at large that bear a lot of the burden of these diseases too. So maybe I'll begin just briefly with InsightTech, what inspired me and the journey that we're on today. I'm a physician, so naturally I kind of entered this world on a one-by-one basis with the patients that I was taking care of, the families that were there with them at the bedside, the surgeries that we were doing on a daily basis, and the profound ability for a technology like InsightTech's focused ultrasound technology to provide access to patients where previously there have been bottlenecks, whether it's fear of an invasive procedure, multiple days in a hospital, not being close to a facility that could provide you a highly specialized acuity of care. All of that breaking the barriers down by utilizing energy in a way that can sit outside of your body in a non-invasive, totally minimally impactful way, using an MRI and imaging sequences that can look deep into your brain, understand the pathophysiology of what's happening, target those areas of the brain, modulate them with energy in a way that is very precise, very point of contact, very closed loop. So not only are you understanding what's happening at the brain level, but also what you're doing and how it's impacting the health and wellness of that patient in real time, and then followed up with best-in-class evidence now multi-years out to show that those are sustained benefits where people are living their lives again, going back to high technical jobs. They're enjoying their family and friends back in social environments, which, as we all know, have profound multifactorial benefits, not only just to the disease state, but to your quality of life, which I think anybody that's innovating in healthcare is focused on quality of life as the ultimate outcome of us as humans and what our impact we want to leave on society is. And so Insight Tech, specific to Alzheimer's, we're using our focused ultrasound technology, which intelligently is able to target and deliver energy to areas of the brain that we know have significant impact with this particular disease, whether they be plaques or origin foci in the brain where the disease is emanating from. We're building that network of understanding about how energy can impact and modulate the onset, the progression, and ultimately, hopefully one day, the diagnosis of that disease. And much like other chronic ailments that we're familiar with, Parkinson's and oncologic tumors in the brain, our understanding of Alzheimer's is improving. Our ability to understand earlier and hopefully modify and create more longevity is improving. And we know that this is not a single disease with one face. It's a multifactorial disease with multiple faces. And thus, the combination of therapeutics, which have spent billions of dollars in development over decades of time, requires full assistance. And combining with technologies like Insight Tech's focused ultrasound, and diagnostics and precision medicine and the best in care teams is the only way that we're going to make a dent in this disease and ultimately help people not only diagnose it earlier, but live better lives with it, and ultimately one day find a cure. And so Insight Tech, I think, took a very measurable approach. We wanted to first make sure that this was a very safe way of using our energy. Alzheimer's brain, as I think many of us know, is a very fragile subset of the way that tissue is diseased. And because some of the plaque-laden regions of the brain can be so fragile, once you're introducing something either invasively or non-invasively, you never want to make a situation worse. And so we've spent years with the FDA in all disease types, but specifically Alzheimer's, where plaque-laden brain can be some of the most fragile, where an introduction of an energy source may cause bleeding, inflammation, unexpected deterioration of the areas in and around it. That our ability to start small, target areas, prove that we can treat it repeatedly, and then begin to treat much larger areas of the brain, multiple areas of the brain at one time, and eventually be able to target anywhere in the brain for multiple treatments, all safe with no device-related serious adverse events, is a legacy already now 5-6 years in the process that Insight Tech is extremely proud of. And when we now pivot and say, hey, this is a really safe and effective technology at delivering energy in the way that we intended to do, we want to translate that effectiveness to therapeutic outcomes and ultimately the quality of life that we talked about and benefiting patients. And so we have the privilege at Insight Tech of working with the world's best neuroscientists, neurologists, neurosurgeons, radiologists, and care specialists working in and around neurodegenerative diseases to design trials that really take a look at, can this energy profoundly change the way that Alzheimer's is modulating your brain and ultimately make a beneficial environment for patient outcomes. So we looked at an energy-only approach first, which was delivering focused ultrasound to plaque areas of the brain and seeing if that made a difference over time. And this is all rooted in amazing evidence, both basic science and translational evidence, that suggests there is a mechanism of action, albeit not wholly understood, that is potentially pro-immune stimulating and plaque clearing, either through access to venous lymphatic or other blood flow circulations, and immune stimulation in the sense of enabling immune clearance, where energy to open the blood-brain barrier in combination with focused ultrasound around areas of plaque in early data through leading institutions led by the folks such as West Virginia, Ohio State, Columbia Cornell University's UT Southwestern, and many others around the world show that if you can target these areas, that plaque, when compared to control areas that are not being targeted by energy, seem to be stable, in some instances regress, and modify potentially the course of the disease. We all know that the volume of plaque and the severity of plaque is corollary to the advancement of dementia in this subset of patients, and that's in other diseases and neurodegenerative care that also have plaque as part of their disease pathology. And so the concept of being able to potentially stop, slow, or even reverse plaque using energy is a very exciting one. And peer-reviewed evidence now in several different formats has looked at not only the acute outcomes in months, but also now years of that continuing to be a source of disease development and progression that focused ultrasound may provide a benefit to patients. And that's something we're really excited about. And because of all of those convening ideas and results and levels of evidence, it's allowed Insight Tech and our partners and the institutions and leading scientists from around the world to think about a better future of how we use this technology. There's two things that I'll specifically talk about. The first one is, using the focused ultrasound technology in combination with therapeutics. Therapeutics that are given on a constant basis, maybe one-time therapeutics, things that are cell therapies or CAR T therapies, that can modify the disease course, but really have a lot of difficulties either getting to the area of the brain they need to get to or synergizing with the areas of the brain that may be dormant or close to their activity. And so we are comprehensively looking at therapeutics and using focused ultrasound, our blood-brain barrier disruption technologies, and the combination of those therapeutics to really benefit patients. And one of the heralding works that's happened is West Virginia, in sort of a leading edge design trial and FDA approval initiation, is looking at the combination of focused ultrasound alongside patients with one of, if not the only recent approved indication of Aduhelm in the treatment of Alzheimer's. And I think a lot of people are really interested if some of the negative side effects of Aduhelm at really high doses can be modified, the benefit can be enhanced, and the combination delivery can provide potentially a more optimistic outcome for the use of therapies similar to those or others that are in the pipeline for discovery. So that's really exciting, and my hat's off and commendation to the scientists that are pushing the edge of this discovery, because it's critical. This is a disease that we can't be receptive to. We have to be proactive and really try to figure out in a multimodal approach the best way to treat it. And the last thing, and really why I'm really excited to be with you today and to explore more, is Insight Tech's U.S. headquarters is based in Miami, Florida. And South Florida and the state of Florida in general, in the last decade, has presented itself as a microcosm of agedness, of disease severity, and of longitudinal tracking that can be hugely beneficial to the way that we think about diagnosis, the way we think about therapy, and the way we think about digital accumulation of data to look at disease progression over time. And because of that, the state of Florida and the Department of Elder Affairs within the state has created an amazing amount of networks that look at memory disorders that are governed by an advisory committee specifically for Alzheimer's, that think about the state of Florida as an economy of discovery around neurodegenerative diseases, specifically Alzheimer's. And as foundational community partners, Insight Tech always looks civically of a way of giving back and a way of helping to develop our communities alongside our technology and our patient care. And that's why we very proudly stood up an organization within government affairs and advocacy led by Jonathan Weiss at Insight Tech, that has passionately invoked our communities and our civic mindedness alongside the state of Florida to build a better economy for future discovery, in addition to what they have so diligently put together. And that's what we've called the Florida Brain State Initiative. And it's the combination of this amazing network of private and public institutions that are all collectively coming together, not siloed, but sharing their data, sharing their intellects, sharing their science across the population of Florida in a Florida for global approach. And with this network, Insight Tech really took a front runner position in establishing it so that multiple companies and multiple technologies can come for the Brain State Initiative. And Focused Ultrasound is proud to be the first one and the founding member of those technologies to really help catalyze and get this going. And so what is the Florida Brain State Initiative? It's a connected network of multiple universities partners, multiple institutional partners on the care and provider side that are coming together in pairs alongside the state of Florida. To date, since the early part of 2021, $9.5 million have been granted through the state of Florida in matching in-kind contributions. So the in-kind contribution has come from Insight Tech to match that, where we are funding clinical studies looking at the combination of focused ultrasound and care in Alzheimer's. And that starts with much of the expansion of the clinical protocols that I discussed earlier around how energy alone can impact the disease progression. And we look to growing that alongside multiple therapeutics and combination delivery. And the benefit is that the patients are here and the patients are waiting. And we've seen a huge interest from the community of patients, the community of advocates in and around Alzheimer's disease and neurodegenerative, and probably most importantly, the community of public and private institutions that have come together. And just to name a few here that are leading off and kicking the Florida Brain State Initiative, we have Florida Atlantic University and Delray Medical Center, Florida International University and Baptist Hospital and Medical Centers, University of Florida alongside both Broward Health and Shands, and University of South Florida alongside Tampa General. So leading institutions globally that we have the benefit of working alongside here in Florida that are looking at the science, utilizing their best-in-class provider networks, and most importantly, offering this as a solution to patients and their families in an exponential and longitudinal way. And this is going to be the backbone of a network that is really going to, I think, make a dent in the way we look at Alzheimer's, we treat it, and how we evaluate where focused ultrasound can play its role in really benefiting this disease over time. So with that, I will pause and hand it over to my colleagues for the next part of this introduction, and look forward to the continued conversation with this entire group and the community that's really trying to make an impact in this disease. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you all on the current status of Alzheimer's disease treatments and focused ultrasound for the future of Alzheimer's disease treatments. I will show my disclosures here because I'm an active clinical trialist. I have done some lecturing for Biogen, and I'm an ad hoc consultant for Roche and Biogen, and I'm involved in several clinical trials with disease-modifying therapies for Alzheimer's disease. Here's my financial support from my institution, various peer-reviewed funding, and thank goodness for philanthropy. So I think before we can talk about treatments, we have to talk about the biomarker era that we're about to enter. And this is because we now actually can measure all of the components that add up to a person having Alzheimer's disease pathology, including injury to the brain. So there's amyloid, tau, and neurodegeneration. And this is summarized from a few years ago when this started to become more available to us, called, A for amyloid, T for tau, N for neurodegeneration. And some people want to add V because vascular is also very important in brain health. But we're focusing on the misfolded proteins, amyloid and tau, and the damage they do, which can be followed through different stages. Cognitively unimpaired, where they may be present, but they're not yet causing damage. Mild cognitive impairment and dementia, where you're sort of initially, you've got some memory problems, but you're actually functioning okay. And then as you become more dependent and need more help in your daily activities, that's called dementia. And then there are the people who don't have any of these biomarkers who would be non-Alzheimer's dementia, which now we can also identify. So the clinical stages are preclinical, presymptomatic. Prodromal would be mild cognitive impairment. Dementia can be classified as mild, moderate, and severe, severe being very dependent on even physical care. And we have various means of assessing this through cognitive testing, measurements of mood and behavior are very important in day-to-day functioning. So these clinical stages are now being addressed, but of most interest, I think, right now is the earlier you go, the better. So we have preclinical, presymptomatic studies that are starting to happen, and prodromal, MCI, and very early mild stage of dementia, where just some of the higher level clinical, day-to-day activities may be affected. So this is just another way of looking at this. There's the biomarker category, and you can see if you've got the pathology change, you've got the continuum from you've got no tau and no degeneration, but you've got amyloid in the brain, and then you have amyloid and tau, but not too much neurodegeneration, etc. It's sort of shown here. And then people who don't have the amyloid component, they might have tau, and they may or not have the neurodegeneration, or they may not have amyloid or tau, but they have neurodegeneration, so some other kind of pathology. So these are all now things that we can identify because of the way we can have measurement of these markers. So this is an example of somebody who's got Alzheimer's disease with amyloid deposition showing on this PET scan here. The areas of red where you can see there's uptake clearly, in the cortical regions, and there's quite a bit of atrophy that you can see in the coronal view down on the left, the right-hand corner. Here is an example of a preclinical person with Alzheimer's pathology changes. You can see a little bit of the red, which is in the cortical region, meaning the person does have amyloid deposits that are starting, but they're still not too severe, and the person is still cognitively normal. Sometimes people can have quite a lot of amyloid change, and they can still be cognitively normal, which is very interesting, and they have some kind of reserve that allows them to combat that amyloid. So having these pathologies doesn't mean that everything is so simple, because there are a lot of comorbidities. And just to kind of see how complicated it is, this is just an example of all the networks that are involved and all the different ways you can have an interest in what you're going to study. I tend to be most interested in brain structure and function. But other people, it's the connectome, it might be the metabolome. The proteome is really relevant now because it's the proteins that we're actually identifying and trying to remove. The genome, that is our genetic predisposition to these conditions. And so it's just to point out that this is a systems biology nightmare that is going to be very challenging for the human brain to solve, but we're making some progress. And the reason I mention this is because when you actually do autopsy studies of people in the older age, usually in their 80s and 90s, you'll find that having Alzheimer's disease alone is actually fairly rare. So on the right-hand side, you can see probable Alzheimer's disease, MCI, and normal controls are to the left. In the religious disorder study, the memory aging program from Chicago, and this is not unusual for other reports of these kinds of findings. So if you look at Alzheimer's disease by itself, you can see there's just a little tiny, maybe 10% are only Alzheimer's disease. Mostly what you see is Alzheimer's with something else. Alzheimer's and V is with vascular. Alzheimer's with another neurodegenerative condition and vascular. Or you can have just V, vascular, Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerations. And these were people who were diagnosed as having Alzheimer's disease. And you can see that in the normal controls and the MCIs, vascular is bigger. So this is something that really you have to be aware of, and it's going to kind of continue to plague us a bit, because just fixing the Alzheimer's pathology may not be enough. In fact, one of the major co-contributors to cognition impairment in older age is what's called brain small vessel disease. And this is just showing different pictures of what the brain looks like in these different kinds of conditions, like raccoons, or in the middle there, and perivascular spaces, microbleeds, microinfarcts, and something called white matter disease up on the right, which becomes commoner as people get older, not as extreme as that, but a certain amount, like a little spot, white matter spot, is present in about 95% of people over the age of 65. And if you think you can talk about just neurons and the brain and amyloid and tau, the truth is, look at that sort of picture of the brain's vascular network, which, by the way, apparently has been calculated to be about 500 miles of vasculature. So it's all packed into this skull that we have, but you can't ignore the vessels. And in fact, amyloid also from Alzheimer's disease enters the vessels, so that it is a cause of stroke. So those are all things you have to bear in mind. The other new pathology that's come to light recently, I just want to mention because it can be confusing. And this is showing something called Alzheimer's pathology, and then other ones that are not Alzheimer's pathology. One of the most important is called TDP-43. And it's just showing you that, again, you can have a mix of these different neurodegenerative conditions. So this is all important for us to understand when we're trying to have treatments that are going to be successful. This just shows the representation of these different types of pathology, with cerebral vascular disease being very highly prevalent. Hippocampal sclerosis is that TDP43. It's a granulin deposition that you can often see in the hippocampus. And this is just showing autopsy confirmed cases with Alzheimer's disease. I won't dwell on this, but the other important thing is you have neuroinflammation. You can have Lewy body disease and Alzheimer's disease. And so these are all going to be challenges we have in the future. So what's exciting, though, is that we now have ways of measuring this. We have, for the last decade almost, we've been able to measure in the spinal fluid these important proteins. A beta 42 deposition, so it goes down as the Alzheimer's disease progresses. CSF tau goes up as the amyloid seems to drive the tau, and it starts to cause further destruction. And you can see that, you know, there's a ratio where if people don't have those components, they don't decline as much. Whereas if you have, you know, the ratio of tau to A beta higher, A beta 42 higher, those are the people who are showing decline. So the amyloid and tau are like a bad gang working together, harming the brain in ways that happen particularly with aging, but now also with genetic predisposition. So the exciting new development is we can now measure these proteins, not just in the CSF, which is a little harder to obtain, although it's certainly obtainable, but actually in the blood. And I would say in the last 2 years or 3 years, this is the most important development for diagnosis and management of Alzheimer's disease and potentially the trials. So first in spinal fluid, and now we can measure it with a technique called SIMOA, single immune molecular way, and this is available commercially now in the US, for example. p-tau 181, neurofilament light, something called GFAP. GFAP is a measure of astrocyte activation, and neurofilament light measures damage to the brain. And then with mass spec, we can also measure the A beta 42, 40 ratios, and there's an available test for that now, and others are emerging. And we can also maybe, with luck, we'll be able to measure the synuclein that's associated with Parkinson's disease with a new technique called RT-QuIC. So what had to happen in the last few years is to show the correlation between phospho-tau, for example, here's 231, in relation to PET, in relation to tau PET or tau in the CSF, showing that they correlate. In other words, what's in the plasma does tell you what's in the brain. It's not perfect, it's not 100%, but it's certainly highly correlated. And the emerging tau isoforms that seem to be important are phospho-tau 181, 217, and 231. And this is showing that as the disease gets worse, it goes up in the CSF. And now they can sort of show this also in the amyloid goes down and the tau goes up. And we can see this now in not just in spinal fluid, but also in the brain itself. So that's the fluid biomarkers, which I think are revolutionizing our approach, because now we can measure it in the blood. We can follow what's happening in the blood if we're doing tests, if we're doing sort of interventions. But let's look at the neuroimaging biomarkers, which are showing us the topography of what's happening in the brain and also the side effects that can happen from these treatments. This is the multimodal signature of Alzheimer's disease. You can have amyloid PET. There's deoxyglucose PET, which shows you metabolism. You've got structural MRI, diffusion MRI, resting state fMRI. There are different MRI sequences that can also be used to measure the sort of neurofilament light version. That is, the damage that's being done to the brain is better measured with structural MRI. But we're now being able to see these actual amyloid and tau deposits as well as tau PET as well. There's a cortical signature that you can see in Alzheimer's disease when you do cortical thickness mapping. This is just showing an example in older people where the areas that seem to be attacked in Alzheimer's disease can be measured. These are like the kind of the key areas, which is called the signature of Alzheimer's disease, involving the parietal and temporal lobes, frontal lobes, precuneus, and the anterior cingulate, for example. Now, the idea is that these amyloid plaques and neurofilament tangles accumulate gradually over time, and as they do, the brain is, deteriorating. And this is just showing this kind of relationship to the time course of these pathologies in the different clinical stages showed here, so that you get the sense that things are gradually happening under the radar, and then they start to emerge in the form of the measures we can make on an MR scan, which has been around for years. Now we can measure it even more accurately with new and faster ways to acquire it. But there's also there are also other factors such as inflammation and the reaction that the brain is doing on its own to try to defend itself against the attack that's going on. And there are genetic predispositions. So let's go to the therapeutics. That's the background. So now let's just talk about what's in the pipeline. So this is an update from basically ClinicalTrials.gov in 2021, showing that there's about 126 agents in 152 trials assessing new therapies for Alzheimer's. 28 are in phase 3. That means they're getting closer to maybe being able to be considered for approval. 74 in phase 2 and 24 in phase 1. The majority now are aspiring to be disease modifying, which is really a development in the last 10 years. 10% aim to improve cognition, 7% address neuropsychiatric symptoms. But now, what's really important is that the biomarkers are being more widely used. More diverse biological processes can be addressed, and also there are repurposing agents that are being explored. But the point is, you're not guessing whether or not the person actually has Alzheimer's disease just from their symptoms, or maybe even from an MRI scan. Now you can actually know if the pathology is there. This just shows some of the mechanisms of actions that are, being considered in all these different attempts to come up with treatments, showing sort of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. It's really just to give you kind of an overview, including protecting the synapses, fighting inflammation, helping with, metabolism and bioenergetics. There's repurposing of some of the diabetic drugs is going on as we speak, because they may help the brain's ability to better use glucose, because they're, it's thought that Alzheimer's disease is like type 3 diabetes. And so there are some of the drugs for diabetes that are now being tried out in trials for Alzheimer's disease. This just gives you the overall view of the picture. Is cut off a little bit on the left. Sorry about that. But this is published every couple of years by Jeff Cummings and his group, where they do these reviews, and it just gives you a feel for what's in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. But it sort of shows you that the disease modifying therapies and the field is becoming really active. Just in the last few years, it's really jumping ahead. This sort of just again summarizes, the number of agents that are in phase 3. Disease modifying therapy is still the majority, symptomatic and neuropsychiatric, and then some of the other ones that are, kind of addressing oxidative stress, even gut-brain, axis, synaptic plasticity, inflammation. So there are lots of ideas that people have that are in development and may be part of the cocktail that you end up using to try to protect the brain. And this shows again in phase 2, just summarizes it. These are the ones that are not quite ready, but they're moving towards application. But again, it gives you sort of a flavor for all the different varieties that are being used. Now, this compares the pipeline for Alzheimer's disease. It was something published a few years ago that was sort of interesting, showing the, the preclinical phase, and you can see it's been very active in Alzheimer's disease. But it ends up, this is the second funnel, with only like 0.5%, having some success. Whereas in the other areas like hepatitis and sort of industry average, which includes a lot of work going on in cancer, for example, and heart disease, etc., there's more success at the end. And I think it's because perhaps there's better knowledge of the basic biology in some of these other conditions, leading to more success eventually when the treatment becomes available, or becomes eligible to be available. So we're still struggling. We haven't got very many approved. In fact, there's only one approved disease modifying therapy, which we'll talk about right now. So this is just to show that there's this kind of cascade from, A beta monitors, that's amyloid beta monomers, to the oligomers. They're where this trouble really starts. They aggregate and then they form fibrils, and pretty soon they deposit as plaques. And so it's along this pathway that people are intervening. And right now, the two most widely under investigation antibodies are attacking the oligomer and the fibrils in order to try to reduce the chance of developing a plaque. This just kind of fills in all the different attempts that people have made at this, and some failed antibodies. But the other important thing to be aware of is that until we started to have these easier ways of having biomarker evidence that the person has the disease, it's thought that in the trials earlier in this last decade or so, the number of people who actually had the disease was about 80%. So it was about 20% of the patients in the trials did not have Alzheimer's disease. So now that's no longer allowable. In fact, everybody has to have a biomarker present in order to be in the trial and to move forward. So I'll just quickly end up by saying, so for primary prevention, what we have is again, this is trying to remove amyloid from the brain in people who have sporadic causes of Alzheimer's disease. There are also some ones that have genetic forms, but the A4 study has been underway for a number of years and is using solanezumab versus placebo. And it's actually going to be reporting out pretty soon. It had to weather the pandemic, and solanezumab is not as powerful a remover as some of the newer generation drugs, so I'll talk about in a moment. But nevertheless, that's still underway, and we'll find out in the new year about whether or not it helped. There was a failed attempt to do a base. This is one of the enzymes that contributes to the development of A beta formation. That failed. There are some autosomal dominant treatment trials underway, the DIAN-2 and the Alzheimer Prevention Initiative. These are now adopting some of the newer antibodies. One trial included gantenerumab and solanezumab. That was the DIAN-2. It's on sort of hold now, about to restart maybe with some new antibodies. Skyline is a Roche gantenerumab application for preclinical, that is asymptomatic patients who have amyloid in the brain, trying to remove it before it contributes to damage. And the AHEAD study is using lecanemab, Desai Biogen, and it's kind of like aducanumab, which I'm going to talk about a bit more right now. So aducanumab published in Nature, actually, their phase 2 study, which was really quite impressive, showing that it was able to remove amyloid quite effectively at these different doses over a period of time. And that led to its major trial, which some of you will know, reported out and did actually achieve FDA approval, but it's been controversial. Anyway, the point is, the reason that the amyloid hypothesis has some validity is because we know that A beta deposits as plaques prior to clinical symptoms, maybe 20 years before you actually know you have it. And so the timing of the amyloid lowering might be very important. There's some animal work that suggests that you can, if you go too late in some animal models, the removal of the amyloid doesn't really make a difference. So timing may be very key to it. And right now, most of the trials are sort of hitting the stage called clinical dementia rating scale 0.5, which means the person may not be totally independent, but they're pretty darn good. And they have cognitive impairment, but they're functioning except maybe very high level instrumental activities of daily living. And that's trying to get at the very, very early stage of MCI or very early AD. The other thing that it was realized is you have to titrate the dose up to achieve the highest dose to be able to really do what you want with these different antibodies. And that was, again, a hard lesson learned, because in the past, sometimes there was like a high dose, a low dose, and placebo. High dose always looked like it might be good, but also there were more side effects. And the truth is, if you get everybody up to the high dose, then you may start to have some beneficial effect. And the low dose and the no dose, the placebo, didn't have much effect. And so that actually brought down the ability to even see if, because you had smaller numbers, to see if there was even a trend. So that's now been learned. That's a lesson learned. And what we have now is second generation antibodies. They are better at removing amyloid. Gantenerumab is sub-Q, aducanumab and lecanemab are infused at the moment. They target the toxic A-beta oligomers and fibrils along the amyloid cascade. There's a whole new development through Eli Lilly with an antibody called donanemab, which targets an epitope on the amyloid plaque itself. And they, in some of their phase 2 studies, showed that they could remove amyloid plaques in 6 months, whereas some of the other ones were taking a year or 2 or 3, getting people up to the right dose to have complete removal. But most of these antibodies can remove amyloid over time, and it varies a little bit with whether they're E4 carriers, how much trouble you get into, and so on. And now there are also anti-tau antibodies under development. Now, I'm just going to quickly mention about the approval of aducanumab, which led to it being validated as an amyloid remover. And then some of the other companies have also sought that recognition. But it also claimed to have, beneficial effect clinically. And that's where there's been some, debate and some difficulty, I think, getting it remunerated in the United States where it has been approved. It has not been approved in Europe. They withdrew their application to Canada. I don't know what's happening in other parts of the world. But so far, it's still in a little bit of a limbo, but it is available in the United States. And so there was a whole article about what's called appropriate use for physicians that actually are able to use this antibody in the United States, showing that you're titrating up along the bottom here in this little diagram. This is published by Jeff Cummings, appropriate use in Journal of Prevention of Disease. It'll show up in the next slide. And it shows that you titrate up and you have to do MRI scans on a regular basis. And that's because as you titrate up, you may run into some more of the problems. Here are what some of the problems are. This is the Journal of Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease 2021. And that is, you can, with the drug, you might have more chance of getting what's called vasogenic edema. As the amyloid is getting out of the brain, it's actually overflowing the exit, as it were. And you get this problem, which can cause seizures and confusion and sometimes hemorrhage. And you can also have microbleeds, which are like blood cells escaping from the vessels that are injured as the amyloid is going along the perivascular spaces. So this is just showing the frequency of having these particular complications just in a placebo group versus aducanumab. And then in overall populations, it's just showing symptoms, not symptoms. It's showing that in E4 carriers, it's even more. And altogether, about 6% that had to stop the trial because of these problems, including you can actually have a cerebral hemorrhage. And that's happened in a couple of these studies. This is just showing some of the criteria. I'm not going to go through this, but it's going to depend on each of the companies. But if you have, the size of the vasogenic edema or the number of microhemorrhages will affect what you're allowed to do. And then just in the same paper, they said, here are the resources you're going to have if you are going to be using these drugs. I think now the blood tests are going to replace the lumbar puncture, but you have to have MR access. You have to have people who know how to make a diagnosis and take care of people. They're now going to be helped by having the amyloid markers in the blood. And also you need sort of genetic counseling, and you need to have culturally competent care. So having said that, where does focused ultrasound come in? We know it can open up the blood-brain barrier. We know it can allow more targeted and more efficient use of disease-modifying therapies, and potentially, uniquely, maybe the gene therapies that may come. We don't know, for example, viral vectors that you might be able to get in to strategic parts of the brain, probably only with something like ultrasound. There's a very small proportion of the amyloid antibodies that actually get into the brain from the blood. This is like maybe 1%. So you're actually wasting a lot of what you infuse or you inject. So the idea with focused ultrasound, especially with what we hope is going to be a successful development of a little kind of helmet that's personalized to each person, so you can actually wear this helmet almost like a bike helmet. You could be doing these infusions or injections, especially some of the injections. You could even be doing this at home, or you could be in the center where you just kind of wear this helmet, which is your own helmet that has the key areas of your brain that are being targeted by, according to the disease. In the case of Alzheimer's disease, I mentioned some of those key areas, which are the dorsolateral frontal and parietal, temporal, and sort of medial, like precuneus and anterior cingulate. This shows you the very first opening that was successfully achieved at Sunnybrook Hospital. I was privileged to be part of that team, showing that we did open up the blood-brain barrier to this person. We were very cautious. We were just doing it the front part of the frontal lobe because we knew if it was injured, that might be less harmful to the person's day-to-day functioning. But happily, nothing serious happened in that first series of 6 subjects. We're now moving on to opening more areas of the brain, including the hippocampus itself, so far without adverse effect. But we were held up quite a bit by the pandemic, and we're hoping and planning to maybe be able to add IVIG or actual antibody mix from humans that could have a therapeutic effect that we could deliver in a more efficient way. So the current state and future direction, biomarkers are key. Stage is also very relevant. Titration is needed slowly and being monitored. There's side effects, and then new forms of delivery. Sub-Q is now becoming more available, but focused ultrasound, I think, may play a role to make it even more affordable because you could use less of the antibody to have the same effect because you can get it in more effectively. And then also maybe therapies that wouldn't be otherwise doable. So with that, I'll acknowledge many trainers and colleagues and Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center, and thank you for your attention.
Oh my gosh, thank you all for those engaging and really informative presentations. Now I'd like to spend a few minutes for the Q&A session. So based on the information that Dr. Black just presented, John, would you share your perspective and discuss with the panelists how we can best move forwards with focused ultrasound clinical trials, especially with regard to how to choose a therapeutic to enhance delivery with FUS-BBB opening?
Surely. So I think that focused ultrasound is important across both the fronts that have been previously described. But in our area, in the conduct of clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease, the evidence is quite clear that the variability of uptake significantly contributes to the delay and cost of all Alzheimer's studies. The blood-brain barrier is a formidable foe in being able to predict when drug is injected into the bloodstream, how much will get across to the brain, as Dr. Black so eloquently pointed out. But I wanted to just say for a minute, let's look at baseline. So you saw the Cummings report on the number of studies in the field. There's been a subsequent report just on the commercial sponsored studies that indicates 86 studies are in the field right now, phase 1 through phase 3. They are all testing therapeutics. They need to enroll 50,000 individuals in those studies collectively to determine over time whether their therapy works. Here's the daunting question. If you took the US alone, but you have Europe and other countries, but in the US alone, we probably don't enroll more than 4,000 subjects per in Alzheimer's a year. The reason for that is the complexity of those studies, the lack of competence of sites. So you only have maybe 200 at most that can do this work. And very importantly, the challenges with dosing and uniform uptake of the drug so that the result can be adequately measured across a very broad spectrum of people. An average phase 3 is running around 3,000 participants now. So the focused ultrasound out of the gate could provide, with further validation, a remarkably promising way to shorten the time of trials, because the likelihood of hitting meaningful dosing and being sure that all the participants are getting the same dosing could be substantially improved. And I don't think you can stress that enough. That is the numbers I gave you of 50,000 randomizations represents the commercial sponsors investing $5 billion to $7.5 billion to just achieve that enrollment cohort. If you can shorten the number of folks you have to screen and shorten the time, you bring enormous savings in the quality of the time to market and also the quality of participants. So the technology being shown here offers enormous and important contributions to the field in that respect. I would add, because nobody else did, and it's always good to try to bring something new to the stew, is there's a sub cohort of patients. I'm sure most of you know, while Alzheimer's slipped to number 7 on the unenviable list of top killers in the United States, Alzheimer's in the Down syndrome community still is number 1. That if you are an adult person with Down syndromes, the most likely disease to kill you is Alzheimer's. And what you're doing with the ultrasound technology should be tested in that community. It's a fragile community. To have a non-invasive technology sorting out the effect of drugs on that community could, and it's a large community, almost 100,000 in the United States are patients with Alzheimer's and Down syndromes. That is a really interesting and important and fragile cohort of patients, and I would encourage a study in that direction as soon as practicable. I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you for those comments. They were super important, and I know JJ and Nir are taking notes copiously about clinical trial enrollment. JJ, do you have any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Susie. No, just compliments to the presentations. And, I think a lot of the work that we're focused on is originated and led by the brilliant minds in basic and translational medicine. And, you're sitting with multiple of them on this call, and I'll just, specifically call out the efforts of Sunnybrook and Nir in particular. We're adopting a lot of our practices from disease states that were referred to by Nir in oncology and other movement-related and neurodegenerative disorders, and trying to apply them to Alzheimer's, since it is such a larger, less understood disease state. And I think just being meticulous about that, proving the safety and feasibility of being able to access any part of the brain was a really critical first step. And now adeptly identifying biomarkers that can lead to a closed loop system of treating and getting feedback is the next, big task on deck. So, I'll defer to Nir, who's really at the front lines, leading a lot of the design and the development that we work so closely with.
Thanks, JJ. And I'll just keep my comments brief because I know we're almost at an end, but I just also want to compliment everybody on the call for their outstanding talks and comments, and Dr. Black in particular, who is a luminary and visionary in this field and has been for a long time. And it's a privilege to work alongside her at Sunnybrook, where we have a sort of a constellation of factors, stars that have aligned that allow us to do the work that we do. I'll just, building on what JJ is saying, it is for sure an iterative process, focused ultrasound and Alzheimer's disease and the neurodegenerative disease in general. Working in the direct-to-brain neuromodulation field, where we use all kinds of tools to interface with the brain, I can say in no uncertain terms, I don't think there's any technology that is as well studied in terms of its preclinical, technical, and now early stages of clinical development compared to other devices. So And I think it's a reflection of its promise, its potential, its myriad mechanisms for Alzheimer's and other diseases. The attention paid to it is proportionate, I think, to its potential, and that's what we're talking about here. So whether we're looking at BBB opening as a therapeutic strategy, whether it's harnessing the body's own endogenous ability to help clear the pathologic hallmarks of Alzheimer's, or as we see it, as a drug delivery or therapeutic delivery strategy, we're looking at things in an iterative, very careful, judicious, but expeditious fashion. We want to get to the point where we're using this in the clinical world, but in order to do that, we need to first illustrate that in fact it's safe. And every time you add a step, whether it's a new therapeutic or whether it's a new target in the brain, whether it's a new population, you sort of go back to square one to sort of illustrate that in fact it is safe and technically feasible to do that. What's important though is for everybody to be aligned, for all the stakeholders to be aligned, so that we don't have to wait for things to be done in serial. We can do things in parallel, and we can move the field along a common front. And that's what we strongly believe in as an ethos here at Sunnybrook, and working with our industry partners at Insight Tech and the FUS Foundation, who have so generally supported our work. So with that, thank you again for having me.
Thank you for those comments. And we literally have maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. So George, I'd like to ask you, with your work with patient advocacy, how can we do better at disseminating this information to patients about focused ultrasound so they can have some hope and maybe interested in learning more about clinical trials and the technology in general? How can we do better?
Well, the foundation is doing a good job on this. This webinar is one little piece of evidence of that. You have a symposium coming up next month, which I'm sure you'll sort of promote at the tail of this conversation. We recently had the Alzheimer's Association International Conference in San Diego. Your favorite 10,000 people showed up. I mean, there are a lot of people out there that are really focused a lot of their professional and scientific efforts on this. And so getting yourself on those stages and getting panels on those is a useful way to get in front of the field. It sounds like Focused Ultrasound has multiple potential ways of accelerating therapeutic interventions or delivery, or to John's point, reducing the cost and increasing the quality of clinical trials by making sure you have common uptake standards of the drug. There are lots of potential ways that Focused Ultrasound might make a contribution. And so obviously we are as patient advocates, want everybody to win so that everybody gets a Nobel Prize, everyone that makes a lot of money on this, because if we do that, that means that in fact patients are getting well served. So we're clearly champions of your work and compliment your work on this effort.
Okay, thank you. And I'm so sorry we're running short on time. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. I'd like to thank all of the panelists and Dr. Black. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. It's invaluable. I would also like to thank my entire team at the FUS Foundation for their tremendous help in planning this. The webinar will be available on the FUS Foundation website within the next 24 hours, so please share it with colleagues and friends, as well as patients and their families. We need your help to increase awareness. We're going to continue these conversations on Alzheimer's disease at our annual FUS Symposium, which is coming up soon, and we have a dedicated Alzheimer's disease session on Monday, October 24th. So if you want to learn more about our symposium, please log on to our website. And again, thank you very much, and everyone have a great day.